Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Emma Roberts, and I'm an art historian. I'm based in the UK. I work at a university in Liverpool, and frequently you can find me on the wonderful Viking ships as an enrichment lecturer. So it's my pleasure that you're joining me here this evening. I say this evening because I'm speaking to you from the UK, but I know that we have people all around the world tuning in. So it's lovely that you're with me, and I hope you're having a great day, no matter what time of the day it is, wherever you are. So as I say, I can be found several times a year on board Viking ships as an enrichment lecturer. So my speciality is in the area of history of art and design. And in fact, I'll be on Viking Venus this Christmas and New Year. I depart on the 22nd of December from Athens and travel 2 cruises back to back and finish in Barcelona. So it would be wonderful to meet some of you there. And some of you might have also met me on previous voyages when we've been sailing together. So this evening, I'm going to be talking about the art of the Vatican, treasures of the Papal Residence. It might very well be that the Vatican has perhaps the greatest art collection in the world, because for centuries, of course, the popes have been far more than just heads of the Catholic Church. They've been voracious collectors of art and commissioners of art. So in fact, we could call them producers of culture. But between 1307 and 1377, the papacy instead was located in Avignon in France rather than Rome. So that dissipated the power of the papacy in Italy, actually, and it meant a delay in their collecting of art. But what happened was when finally in 1377, the papacy was restored to Rome, its traditional seat, the various popes in a sequence from that date wanted to show their power, their return to the papal seat. And they did this strenuously by going on a big commissioning campaign, really, to acquire artists and architects and to build up Rome, to really show its strength and as the true home of the papacy. So it was indeed a visual display of power. And it's from then that we started to get the building of these sorts of structures that we now see whenever we visit the Vatican City in Rome. So this I would call a great architectural statement. It's the Grand Plaza, of course, in front of St. Peter's Basilica. This is reinforcing the perception for the general public that the Catholic Church belonged in Rome and that the papacy was powerful and back to the power that it had before it had to go to Avignon in 1307. So it was Pope Alexander VII in 1655 who commissioned the great sculptor and architect at that time, Bernini, to design this series of columns that we can see here. It's meant, in Bernini's eyes, to be symbolic of the Catholic Church being like a mother to everybody, because Bernini felt that by designing this 2 arms of columns, he was representing the Catholic Church encompassing all the people and making us feel welcomed and secure and embraced into the Catholic Church. So that was a good idea, and it did indeed consolidate the Basilica as the most important place in the whole of the Rome area. So this photograph is taken from the Basilica itself, and that was designed earlier actually by the famous Renaissance architect Bramante. So whenever we visit Rome, we have to think about all the different layers that accumulate. It wasn't planned like the streets in New York all in one go. It's various layers, and we unpeel these like an onion actually to get to the heart of what is the Vatican City in Rome. And if we take another closer look at Bernini's columns, you can see that as well as this idea of embracing people into the heart of the Catholic Church, he wanted simultaneously to remind us all that Rome was the historic centre that ancient Rome so famous for. And he wanted to look forward to say that the popes are here for the future and they're building anew, but he wanted to simultaneously say, but we also tap into the power of the ancient city of Rome, the ancient Rome that everyone knows was so powerful. And that's why he designed these in classical features. You can see there's a pediment and a tympanum over the columns here. So that was to signal that modern Rome that's looking forward still looks back and unites to ancient Rome with its wonderful, important heritage of philosophy and democracy and all the learning that came from ancient Rome. But as I say, they didn't just want to look backwards, they were also cautious and conscious of looking forwards. So this huge commissioning regime that the various popes went on, one after another, they just kept building on the strides that each pope had accumulated before. So you can see how they decorate the interior of the Vatican in an incredibly sumptuous manner. And this isn't a particularly important room, actually, where you can see artworks that are very famous being displayed. But this is one of the rooms that you would walk through in order to get through to, say, the Sistine Chapel. But even here, they took great care and made sure that the most important artisans and artists of the day were available to be able to paint the ceiling and the wall and the floors with the beautiful marble. So there was no expense spared whatsoever. And indeed, inside the Vatican, we see a huge array of treasures. It's most famous, of course, for the Sistine Chapel, but that's not all that's there to see. There are actual freestanding paintings, there's gemstones, there's religious objects such as historic chalices or historic robes, there's scientific instruments, rare maps, documents, and the libraries are fantastic with extremely rare historic books that are priceless in their own right. So we can see this consciousness of a new era and the responsibility that each pope carried as a producer of culture. That's visible in this painting by Milazzo da Forti. This was to show that Pope Sixtus IV had commissioned a new library for the Vatican. And this was before the Basilica was built or before Bernini's columns. But as I say, the Vatican City was built in different stages. So an important stage was when Pope Sixtus decided to commission an important library. It was designed to be a model humanistic library to promote the idea that humans are responsible for creating our own knowledge and forging our own intellectual and social development. We don't just have to wait for God to touch us on the shoulder and make us into geniuses. We have some responsibility ourselves too. So that was contemporaneous Catholicism of the day, quite a modern idea really. All the characters that we can see in this image were very well known to people high up in the clergy in Rome at that time in 1477. So that's important to realise. This was like watching the news at the time. They would recognise the people in the scene. And also do note the conspicuously classical architectural setting here, which might remind you what I was saying earlier about the edges of Bernini's columns. This is again to link back to the historic time of ancient Rome and still point forward that new things are happening in Rome. So that's a theme. I'll probably pick up on that a few times as we going through today's talk. Similar aims actually were intended in the commissioning of this work by Perugino, the delivery of the keys. Again, it was commissioned by Pope Sixtus IV, and this one decorates the walls inside the Sistine Chapel, which took a long time to fully decorate. So Michelangelo's famous works were done much later on than this work. But of course, the Sistine Chapel is the setting for the most solemn and important of the papal ceremonies. So it's most appropriate that this really highly charged image was chosen to decorate the walls inside the chapel. So what we can see here is Christ instituting the church. He's giving the keys to St. Peter. St. Peter's kneeling on the floor and accepting the keys from Christ. So it's a highly symbolic image, and it's in a highly symbolic setting. It doesn't depict any real setting, but it's referencing the very early basilica that was built on this site that now is occupied by the St. Peter's Basilica. And the earliest one was built there around 327 by Pope Constantine I. So this is a reference to the first basilica in that same site that we now see in Rome. But as you can see, all the imagery here is classical. So again, there's that same theme. They want to remind us that Rome has been very, very important for a long time, many, many centuries, and is still going to be very important in the future. And we can see there's two fanciful, imaginary designed triumphal arches with their links to Christianity too. And the central image there with the dome, that, as I say, is imaginary, but it's a reference to the ideal perfect church that was a design by the famous Renaissance architect Alberti. So there's a lot of learning and layers in this image. And behind, in the distance, we see the landscape. It was quite unusual to have a painted landscape in a painting of this time. So we can see that Perugino was breaking new ground here. Later, he became the teacher of the famous Raphael, and Raphael often put landscapes into his paintings, so he must have learned this from Perugino, for example, in this particular painting. And what I find is fascinating, in this image, we can see a self-portrait of the artist himself, Perugino. He wanted to contact us and to communicate with us. So if you look to the right-hand side where the figures are, he is the fifth one in from the right. He's giving us direct eye contact and he has a black cap on. So it's really nice that even today in 2021, we can look at Perugino and see his face and stare him in the eyes and have some sort of communication with him. But he was from the Florence area. So you might be wondering, why am I talking about a Florentine artist when I'm today here to be talking about Rome? Well, that's because the most important artists that Rome is so famous for actually are usually from Florence. They were moved over from Florence because that was where the heart of the Renaissance was. So the artists were selected and taken over to Rome and commissioned. So the Renaissance was in Florence at its pinnacle. So other examples of Florentine artists who were transported to Rome, as well as Perugino, would include later on Michelangelo, Raphael, Ghirlandaio, and Botticelli, for example. And talking of Michelangelo, of course, his most famous work is the Sistine Chapel. That's the real jewel of the Vatican City. And this, we could say, is a triumph of the Renaissance in Italy, but especially of the Renaissance in Florence, because it's an expression of the work of that great Florentine artist, Michelangelo, even though it's cited in Rome. And it's Michelangelo who always takes the credit, really, for painting the Sistine Chapel. But you'll already remember I mentioned Perugino painted one of the works on the side, inside. Lots of artists actually worked on the interior of the Sistine Chapel. But Michelangelo is famous for the ceiling and for that main wall that we can see in front of us there with a blue background, the high altar wall. But other artists did lots of other parts. So it's a collaborative work, actually. But Michelangelo definitely broke new ground, as you can see in the main altar wall with the blue background that I highlighted earlier. And it might interest you to know that he was reluctant to be employed on the Sistine Chapel. And that was because he saw himself as a sculptor, and that was where his passion really was. So he didn't really fancy doing these fresco wall paintings, and they are frescoes. That's important to note, actually, because fresco painting is really a form of mural painting. So it's incredibly physical and demanding. And it's very time specific. It's an act of painting directly into the wet plaster on the wall. So the artist has to be extremely clever and think very far ahead and make sure that all the ingredients really for doing the painting, such as wet plaster, are exactly at the perfect optimum condition for them to work on. So no wonder he was a bit reluctant to do all this work, even though he's done the most fantastic job. And we can see the importance of his work, but he knew himself this was going to be a landmark work, even though he didn't want to do it. And we know he thought it was very important because he produced countless drawings in order to get the composition right. Some of those are still available in archives for people to see. He wanted to make sure the composition was perfect. And in this image, it's extremely complex as a composition. That's another theme that I'll probably talk a little bit about as we go on through the talk today. So what we're seeing here is Christ in the center, and he's separating on the day of judgment all the damned from the people who are going to heaven. So the damned are on the right-hand side of the wall, and the people going to heaven are on the left-hand side of the wall. There's around 400 figures in this image alone. So no wonder he had to do lots of drawings to make sure that everything was perfect. But what's interesting though, it's quite an old-fashioned view of Christ really, because all the figures show fear of Christ. It's more an Old Testament view that people are living in fear rather than seeing him as a beneficent person to look up to. Even Mary is showing fear of Christ and hiding under his elbow, if you like. And all the damned in the bottom right are being rowed from Hades into hell, as you can see. But one very interesting feature of this wall is St. Bartholomew. So on the main wall, he was slightly below Jesus Christ, a little bit to the right of center. And here I'm now showing you a detail of this image. St. Bartholomew's history is that, most unfortunately, he was martyred by having his skin flayed off him whilst he was alive. So it's a most strange image that we can see Michelangelo chose in which to paint St. Bartholomew. He's showing the saint holding his future own flayed skin in his hand. And you can even see the horrific knife that will be used to strip St. Bartholomew of his skin. So it's a very dramatic image. And again, you can see all the fear associated with Catholicism in this image. But what's quite interesting once you realize is that Michelangelo is thought to have painted his own self-portrait on the face of what should be St. Bartholomew on the flayed skin. You can see the dark curly hair. Michelangelo is known for having dark curly hair. So here's a way for the artist to get his self-portrait into the image. So it interestingly tells us that selfies are not just a new thing. After all, artists have been trying to find ways of having their selfies in their art for quite a long time. And already I told you about Perugino doing the same thing too. So what we are seeing then by artists trying to show their own image in their artworks is a self-consciousness about their role as an artist in the High Renaissance. Until the early Renaissance, artists were just artisans. They were the same as bricklayers or wood carvers or stained glass makers. There's no hierarchy that an artist was a person of genius, like we tend to think of them today. But it was during the Renaissance that this concept of the artist changed. And Michelangelo is one of the people who actually depicts that change for us by putting his self-portrait into art. We can see he wanted to say to us, I'm an important person, my image needs to be recorded, you need to know this is me and I made this, and I want you to know this even if this work is around for another 1,000 years. So we see the changing status of the artist here. But as I say, you can imagine how complex it would be to bring 400 people together in that composition, as I told you there are in this amazing image. So artists like Michelangelo, especially working on huge murals that are frescoes, had to be good draftsmen as well as good painters. And Michelangelo is definitely an excellent draftsman, even though he's a wonderful painter and a wonderful sculptor too. You can see his draftsmanship here because of all the muscles and the anatomy being clearly defined. anyone who's not a good draftsman wouldn't be able to illustrate the structure of the human body as he's able to do. But this ability to coordinate complex schemes is another theme I wanted to dwell on as we go through the talk today. That's also shown in Pinturicchio's work. Now, this work, as you can tell here, is actually cited in Siena. So again, you might be thinking, why am I going off the point to talk about a work of art in Siena? But hopefully I'm not doing that, because the reason I wanted to show it is it's showing us the inside of the first basilica that was built in Rome, the one that was built in 327. So it gives us an insight into what was there before St. Peter's and how it looked. So it was very grand and beautiful there. You can see the columns, and there's a gilded mosaic up in the apse in the upper section of the image there. And it's telling us the story of the popes. What we're witnessing in this image is the coronation of Pius II, a pope at the time. He was chosen to be pope out of the other options because it was thought that he would be a really active promoter of the Catholic Church and its crusades against the Ottoman Empire. So it's an interesting insight into the role of the Catholic Church as a warring body, if you like. So I wanted to show you a little bit about what the original basilica was like before it was demolished by Pope Julius II in order for Bramante's new basilica to be sited. But the other reason I wanted to show this was to continue with the theme of complex compositions. Because again, you can see how Pinturicchio has managed to coordinate all those people that are to represent the audience at the coronation together in the one image. It's very skillful manipulation of figures. And once more, this image reinforces the power of the papacy. That's the point of it being painted, even though it was sent to be displayed inside Siena Cathedral. Many of you might have seen this if you visited the cathedral in Siena. Pinturicchio was a studio assistant at the same time as Raphael, both taught by Perugino, whom I mentioned earlier. So they're all now great names from the High Renaissance. And Raphael was also employed to design some paintings inside the Vatican. And I know this painting that I'm showing you now is actually on display in the Borghese Gallery in Rome. So it's still possible to go and visit and book to see this painting. But soon I'll come on to show you some of the works that Raphael was employed to do for the interior of the Vatican itself too. But the reason I wanted to mention this one briefly before I come on to his Vatican works is because this is the painting that forged Raphael's reputation, following his apprenticeship with Perugino and alongside Pinturicchio. And again, I wanted to keep with the theme of complex composition. That's why I wanted to show it as the next image from my previous painting. Because here you can see again what a complex composition it is, even though there's far fewer people visible in this particular painting. That's why it started Raphael's reputation as a great artist, because people at the time thought it was a most harmonious and yet elegant composition. It's got a lot of movement in it. The people look dynamic, and yet we can see everybody really clearly. So you can see why the Renaissance artists are so important these days. They developed ways of handling figures in art that had never been done before. And as well as being harmonious and dynamic, the composition is also rhythmic. There's a serpentine line that goes above. We might enter the painting, for example, psychologically from the left-hand side, go up over those figures, come down in the center, and go up over the figures on the right-hand side too. So our eye is experiencing a journey in this painting. And what is being showed, of course, is the transportation of Christ's body to the tomb following his crucifixion. But it contains a most interesting sub-theme. There was an important family in Rome at the time called the Baglioni family, and they were feuding in what today we would see as a mafia-like feud with another important family. And it so happened that the lady, the mother of the Baglioni family, her son was killed in this mafia-type battle. So she was suffering all the traumas of losing her son. So she actually commissioned this painting from Raphael to expunge her own traumas, really, as well as to honour the Catholic Church. She wanted to show what it was like for a mother to lose her son and have that enormous loss. So we can see on the right-hand side of the painting, there is the Virgin Mary with a black veil and a brown gown. She's so overcome by losing her son at the crucifixion, she's collapsing and all her handmaidens have to hold her up. So this is how Mrs. Baglioni was feeling at the same time. So not only are we able to empathise with the Virgin Mary over her loss, but with the lady who commissioned this painting over her loss. So a very interesting duality of themes in this painting. So the challenges faced by Renaissance artists, especially in their roles for the Vatican, meant that these sorts of skills for composition were essential. And I say that it's especially true because of their commissioning for the Vatican, because they had to work often in situ with architectural spaces that were pre-designed for them. So they couldn't just create a rectangular painting and then ask for it to be hung on the wall of the Vatican. They had to work according to the space that the architect designed for them. And of course, that's what we see with the Sistine Chapel ceiling. The space was predestined for Michelangelo. He couldn't really choose how large it would be or how small it would be or anything like that. Before Michelangelo was commissioned to do the ceiling, it had been in existence for quite a few decades, but was just painted blue with stars on it. People quite liked that, but the Pope at the time decided that he would like to have a more dramatic ceiling that was more linked into the Testaments. So in order to cope with the compositional difficulties of lots of figures being placed on a ceiling above him, Michelangelo designed 5 pairs of columns and he painted them on in trente l'huile, we'd call it, this fake architectural device of 5 columns. So that was a compositional device to divide the space, to allow him to have frames, really, in order to do his paintings within. So what we are seeing within those 9 spaces between the pairs of columns are scenes from Genesis. They alternate in large and small spaces between the columns. And on the long sides of the wall, of the ceiling, there are what we can see as triangles, but they're not triangles. They're what architectural historians would call lunettes above the windows. But of course, this is photographed from beneath, so everything is a bit compressed. So within these triangles, there are scenes from the generations of Christ's ancestors. And the 4 corner triangles, which are called spandrels, shows Old Testament scenes. So there's a lot of complexity going on there. And the intense effect that seems to be figures writhing and boiling and moving when one walks into this room and looks up horrified the Pope who'd commissioned it, who was Pope Julius II. He had simply asked Michelangelo to paint the 12 apostles, and this is what was the result. So much more dramatic, much more going on than Pope Julius II imagined. So he refused to pay Michelangelo for the 4 years of work that it took Michelangelo to do this. And famously, the conditions were terrible. He had to erect an enormous scaffolding and lie often on his back, painting with poor light and extremely difficult conditions. So what a magnificent work it is after all of this. And some of you might have seen all this played out really in the famous movie from the 1960s called The Agony and the Ecstasy with Charlton Heston in the lead role. So if you haven't seen that and you're interested in the Sistine Chapel, you might enjoy watching that movie. So Michelangelo was very bitter about not being paid for 4 years of all this work. But thankfully, once Pope Julius II died, the next Pope who came along did decide he would pay Michelangelo. So eventually he got the money that he deserved. The most famous element in the ceiling is, of course, the creation, this little scene, which is often reproduced on postcards and other things. It's most famous. Here we see why Michelangelo, along with Raphael, changed painting forever after they existed. We see here that awe is being introduced into art, and every part of the image is replete with power and meaning. In particular, I think it's a stroke of genius to have a tiny gap between the fingers of God and Adam. That acts like an electrical charge. I think if the fingers were joined, it wouldn't be nearly as powerful. But the fact that we can sense that they will be joined and that the world will be created at that moment, that adds a lot more drama and charge than if they were already joined. And we also see the intense and meaningful gazes of all the figures in this scene. So gazes and their power is another theme that I can dwell on a little bit today. That's something that a lot of these Renaissance artists working in the Vatican City dwelled upon. We can see that similar focus in this work by Raphael. So now I am talking about one of Raphael's works, which is cited actually in the Vatican Museums itself, in the Stanza Della Signatura. So stanza just means album, really. So it's a series or album of paintings done in the library in the Vatican Museums. In this image, we can see two planes of figures and the relationship between the two levels of figures. The relationship is created because of the gazes between the figures looking up and the figures looking down. Otherwise, it would just be rather too separate as two separate planes of figures. But even though they are physically separated, psychologically, we can still see the relationship between them because of the gazes, which is why I wanted to come on to this image. The gazes acts to link the two planes. So the image depicts the relationship between the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And we see the connection between the heavenly church of between the heavenly church of the church and the real church of the church down below in the earth. We can see that relationship between them. And the centrality is that the Eucharist is between, uniting them. So we can see a focus on the Eucharist above the altar that's between those two layers of figures. So as I say, this is one of the stanza or items in the album or series that's in the library in the Vatican Museums. So it's the Pope's private library, actually. Today, when we visit the Vatican, we can go in and see these works. But at the time, and for many centuries, it was the private library of the Pope. So he could just gaze on these works by Raphael and enjoy them. But because it's a library, all of the works painted by Raphael here are highly intellectual. And they represent each of the four stanzas at one of the disciplines of learning. So the four disciplines of learning that they believed in the Renaissance were theology, philosophy, poetry, and law. Of course, today we might think differently. We might think chemistry or maths are most important ideas of learning. But in those days, it was theology, philosophy, poetry, and law. So if I move on to show you the one that's about philosophy, this is one of the stanza or images painted by Raphael. It's called the School of Athens because everyone knows that in Athens, philosophy was founded. So we can see different branches of philosophy being displayed in this image. Lots of ancient philosophers are shown here amongst the characters, all spaced out. And once more, what a triumph of composition it is, because we can still see each one clearly, and yet it looks like a melee, an interesting scene for the eye to look at. The space is referencing the new Bramante St. Peter's Basilica, the one that replaced the one that was designed in 327 that I showed you earlier in the Pentaricchio image. So now the artist is saying, we have this wonderful space just next door, that's the Basilica. I need to show this for the Pope to remind him, this is where we're living now, even though ancient worlds, such as the ancient world in Athens, was very important for producing philosophers, but we're still doing great things today in Rome. In the center, we can see Plato in the red and purple gown. He's got his finger pointing upwards at the heavens. That's because his type of philosophy is famous for the world of ideas. But Aristotle, next to him in the blue and brown gown, has his finger pointing downwards rather, because his philosophy was more about the world of ideas and the rational living world that we live in today. There are other contemporaneous figures in the scene. In fact, in the bottom center, the man in the pale purple gown with the brown trousers and the black hair is a portrait of Michelangelo, but it's meant to be the philosopher of Heraclitus, even though Raphael was honouring his colleague Michelangelo by painting Michelangelo's face there. So here's this thing about portraits and self-portraits again. And to increase that point, on the right-hand side, we can see Raphael's own self-portrait too, very far right, just where there's a jutting out of the top of the column. It's jutting out into Raphael's black cap. And in fact, I'll show you a detail of it more clearly here. There you can see Raphael's self-portrait with the black cap. So I mentioned earlier I'd refer to self-portraits as I continue through the talk, and this is another example of this. So I just wanted to remind you again that artists like Raphael, Michelangelo, Perugino wanted to show to us that they feel their status is very important and no longer just that of an artisan any longer. I love the fact that we can look into Raphael's eyes and communicate with him. But Raphael was more and more conscious of gazes. I know I showed you earlier the painting with the Eucharist, which is one of the library stanzas, where gazes were important. But to move on to another image where gazes are very important from Raphael is his Sistine Madonna, a painting commissioned by Julius II, who was the same person who commissioned Michelangelo for the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. So with this image, our gaze enters from the right-hand side with Saint Sixtus. We follow his gaze up to the Virgin Mary and the baby Jesus. She then advances purposefully towards us. Then we look down to Saint Barbara on the right-hand side, and she closes the circle by she herself looking down to the two cherubs who are looking upwards. So there's a circle going on in that image. And we, the viewers, are standing down below looking up at all this. Incidentally, of course, the two cherubs in this image are often reproduced on greetings cards, posters, diaries. And if you go to Rome, you'll see this as one of the most popularly reproduced images as popular culture all across Rome. But in a way, that's a shame because they're often seen out of context, because the whole image does show us with those other characters in at the same time. But you can see how it's an important image associated with Rome, even though in fact the image is now on display in an art gallery in Dresden. But it's a Sistine Madonna to link us with the Sistine Chapel. But I think these cherubs are so important in popular culture because of their endearing naturalness. And it's said that Raphael painted them from the children who were one of his female models he was using for Virgin Mary. So she had her children with her in the studio, so he painted them for the cherubs. It's nice to know then that that's the real life of these artists and their models. They were interacting like that socially, and little things just happen accidentally that we now see as fait accompli, but they were just accidental at the time as to who modelled for which artwork. But as Raphael matured, his characters and composition became ever more natural as in this really beautiful image, the Madonna of the Chair. Here, his compositional skills are in evidence again. He's chosen a circular or tondo format that creates for us now a centripetal composition that looks as if some energy is turning around, rather like a bicycle wheel, I suppose. The composition is all pivoting on Jesus's elbow, which is the exact center if you look at it. Then from there, everything else spirals out. Jesus's arm spirals out, the Virgin Mary's arm spirals out, the heads spiral out as other circles. And there's even a circle as the knob on the chair on which the Virgin Mary is sitting. So extremely interesting composition. And all of this, of course, is subliminal for the viewer, but on a deep level, we would understand it and be excited by that dynamism in the composition. Yet it still seems artless and simple when we look at it overtly without anyone pointing out that these things are going on in the composition. Raphael here has clearly studied and researched details from life in order to be more realistic. So we can see he must have studied the fabric of the Virgin Mary's turban, the fabric of the shawl on her, the furniture. There's a lot of imagery from real life that brings us more closely to what life was like at Raphael's time. And similar issues are apparent in another one of Raphael's stanzas in the library. This time it's the fire in the Borgo. So here he spent a lot of time studying things from life, again, such as ancient classical urns or classical architecture, like the Corinthian columns that are in the center of the image. These are remnants from ancient Rome that were being discovered at this time in Rome in 1514 when Raphael was painting. So he went around and looked at these things and reproduced them accurately in the painting, as well as all the costumes. The origin behind this particular image was that the Pope at the time, who was Leo X, asked Raphael to paint episodes from the history of the papacy that were connected with popes who had the name Leo in their title. So he must have had an ego then. He wanted to connect himself to the lineage of important Leos who were popes. So what we're seeing is a scene from the life of Pope Leo IV. He's the person in the far distance, in the upper center of the image, in the balcony. We can see him in his papal gown. What he's doing is issuing a benediction, because we're witnessing one of the terrible fires that ripped through Rome at the time in 847. It was a devastating fire for Rome, actually, and caused a lot of damage. But people say at the time that it was Pope Leo IV who stopped the fire by issuing a benediction. And on the left, there are some people who are trying to put the fire out, but in the front center, we see a lady in a yellow gown, and she is focusing her attention on the Pope. So what we're being told in the painting is that we shouldn't try and put the fire out, because it's only the Pope who can put the fire out with his proclamation. So what an interesting idea. Some people would say you have to live your life with practical effort, and some people would say it has to be more philosophical or religious, such as praying. So definitely the theme of this image is that praying is more effective in solving problems than any practical action. So Leo X fulfilled his aim of being connected to Leo IV, and it was a beautiful image done by Raphael. But as I say, Raphael has made a point of showing some objects that are remnants from the time of ancient Rome here. Raphael's very important in now ensuring that the history of Rome has been preserved for us. When we go and visit Rome, we can see lots of beautiful buildings like the Pantheon, or different monuments that have remained and been discovered and have been left there in situ for us to look at. That was in danger of never happening, because in the early part of the 1500s, people just used to go into Rome, find an old Roman column from ancient Rome, smash it up into smithereens and use it as the basis for whitewash for new buildings that were going up. They didn't value these remnants at all. They just saw it as a decrepit examples from previous society. But Raphael was really worried about this. So he wrote a petition to the Pope in 1514 to say that he thought some laws should be brought into effect in order to safeguard the monuments in Rome at the time. Thank goodness that happened. The Pope at the time did approve those laws, and this is why we have so many wonderful sights left to see when we visit Rome on board a Viking excursion. So Raphael is obviously a Pope fan, and he painted a famous portrait of the Pope who issued the law then to preserve the ancient monuments in Rome, Pope Leo X, the one who wanted to commemorate himself by being linked to Pope Leo IV. So we can see here the real pinnacle of the power of the papacy. And this also corresponds with the high point of the High Renaissance too. We see the Pope holding a most famous precious Bible that's part of the treasures of the Vatican archives. He's trying to read it with his magnifying glass because he must have been a little short-sighted. But it's no wonder that he loved art, because this particular Pope, Leo X, happened to be the son of the great famous Medici family head, Lorenzo the Magnificent from Florence. So Lorenzo the Magnificent really fueled the Renaissance in Florence and commissioned all those wonderful Florentine artists to start the Renaissance. And as I said, those artists were then transported to Rome. So here we see that Lorenzo the Magnificent's son has also been transported to Rome and instituted as the head of the Catholic Church as Leo X. But he didn't lose his love of his family's art collection and wanted to ensure that the Vatican went on to buy more and more art and increase its collection. So we definitely see this image as a high Renaissance image of greatness and the climax of greatness for the papacy, perhaps. The popes have the power to commission great art at this point and respect from all around the world. But unfortunately, that wasn't to last, actually, because not long after this image was painted in 1518, in 1527, there was the sack of Rome, when Rome was sacked. So this is part of the Protestant Reformation that was beginning to build up across Europe in contrast to Catholicism. And there's a mix of political, religious and military reasons behind the sacking of Rome, but it was quite a devastating event in Rome's history, and the Pope, who was in power at that time, had to hide via a secret tunnel out of the Vatican into a place of safety. So not only is the sack of Rome associated with the Reformation in Europe, but it's part also of the Italian wars that were happening in Europe between 1497 and 1559. Spanish and German troops who were underneath the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, attacked the city, and 50,000 people were murdered in Rome during the sacking in 1527. So no wonder the Pope had to go into hiding. Lots of wonderful artworks were burned or damaged. They got into the Vatican and set fire to things. So it was a terrible event in Rome's history. And that event now is actually seen as the end of the High Renaissance and perhaps the lessening of the power of the papacy in Rome. And that, oh, by the way, here is a 19th century painting of the sack of Rome. So it's not from the time, but it's just to give you an idea of all the chaos that occurred at the time. You see lots of people being murdered here and the devastation that was happening. But an image that now shows the lessening of the power by 1545 of the papacy is apparent in this painting by Titian. It's another portrait of a pope, Pope Paul III by this point, but he looks much more frail. And generally this image is viewed as conveying the lessening of the power of the papacy. Titian is actually a Venetian artist who really pioneered the use of oil painting, but like many famous artists, he went to Rome because he thought this was the place where he could make his fortune. But as soon as he got there, he realized it was a hotbed of political and social problems by this time, post the sacking of Rome in 1627, actually. And what we're seeing is Pope Paul III in his 70s with his two grandsons. And unfortunately, Pope Paul III is known now not at all to be a religious man, despite his position as head of the Catholic Church, as Pope. He's known to have fathered lots of illegitimate children and to have authorized lots of murders and done terrible things during his time as head of the church. But here, what we're seeing is him trying to strengthen his position, his family's position for the future too, in the papacy, because he's deciding here who to give the next important role in the Catholic Church to out of his grandchildren. And he's given his grandson on the left the position of cardinal. That's Alessandro Farnese, who's been authorized by his grandfather to be cardinal. So the painting is about the scheming that occurs in families when powerful leaders become old. The two grandsons are maneuvering amongst themselves for position in the future of the Catholic Church. This is now seen as one of Titian's finest works. Although actually, Titian left it unfinished. It's finished enough to look like a great work to us, but it's technically unfinished. And that's because he began to get so scared in 1545 about the atmosphere in Rome at the time that he just abandoned it and left it in the vaults of the Farnese family, who had commissioned this painting from him. And it wasn't found for several decades. It was left unframed. And that's not an insignificant point, I think, because the Farnese family were the ones who are being shown in this image. I already mentioned that Alessandro Farnese is the grandson on the left, who's the new cardinal, and he commissioned this portrait. And the Pope himself was formerly from the Farnese family too. So we sense the danger and the atmosphere in Rome at the time through this painting. But I wanted to mention the Farnese family palace, which is a wonderful place to visit in Rome. A lot of people focus all their attention on the Vatican, no surprise there, of course, but then they might miss out too on seeing the Palazzo Farnese, which has a ceiling almost to rival the Sistine Chapel, actually. I was certainly wowed when I visited here myself. So if you are visiting Rome on a Viking ship, you might very well like to make an additional trip to this place here. So Alessandro Farnese, who commissioned the painting that I just showed you by Titian, also commissioned the painting of the ceiling by the Bolognese artist Carracci. And it's a fantastic, rising, sensuous mass of figures. Again, a triumph of composition. But I say sensuous, and I'll show you a detail. Perhaps it's a little bit surprising to realise that a work commissioned by such a family linked into the papacy should be so visceral and physical and sensuous. But even though we might not think of the popes in those terms today, as I mentioned, Pope Paul III was certainly not the sort of pope you'd expect, having fathered lots of illegitimate children. And they did live, this family did live a life of sensuality and debauchery. This pope at the time was lascivious, sensual and saucy, and his children and grandchildren took after him. So they are really reflecting that by the commissioning of Carracci to do this most sensual ceiling painting. The painting is called The Love of the Gods, and it's all about the sensual love that can be seen also in the ancient people in the Bible. So although this painting isn't part of the Vatican museums, I didn't want to miss the chance to tell you about it in case you visit Rome. And it's intrinsically connected to the popes of the Vatican City anyway. And just before I finish, there are one or two other artworks at the Vatican itself that I wanted to mention as must-see works if you do go there. So I'll just mention these before closing. One of these is the Apollo Belvedere. This is now seen as one of the world's most iconic artworks. And originally in 120 AD, it was thought to set the standards for ideals of aesthetic perfection and how the male physique should be. So for many centuries onwards, people have looked back to this work to think, what should the male body look like at its best? Actually, it's a copy of an ancient Greek bronze from about 350 BC, which was melted down for its richness as a piece of bronze. But at least now we have the copy made by the Roman artist. So really what we're seeing is an ancient Roman artist honouring an ancient Greek artist, but this is still for us to see in the Vatican, linking the Vatican today through to this important history all the way back to ancient Greece. This artwork has been revered many times. It's been parodied by artists and in popular culture. It's been referenced in many artworks, and it's even been discussed in works of literature, such as poetry by Byron, who spent a long time in Rome. And a lot of artists reuse the pose of the Apollo Belvedere too in their own artworks. And another wonderful artwork that we should see in Rome is one that represents Rome's supremacy in art, and that's the Laocoon, which is always rather difficult to say. So this again is a sculpture made by a team called the Great Sculptors of Rhodes. So it's an ancient Greek work actually, but it was discovered buried in Rome in 1506. And it was identified as a statue that had just been known in mythological terms at the time by the great writer Pliny the Elder. He had written about this work. But Pliny the Elder is that man who died in the famous Vesuvius eruption in Naples. So unfortunately, we didn't hear more writings from him later. But he did at least put to record that this fantastic sculpture by the Great Sculptors of Rhodes was in existence. And nobody knew where it was or what it looked like till it was discovered in 1506. And the Pope at the time, in 1506, said he would like to have this as a work in the Vatican collection. And that's really what started the Vatican as being an art collection for the public, not just a private place for the various popes in sequence to be able to enjoy the art. So it depicts Laocoon, a priest of Apollo in the city of Troy. He was the one who warned the Trojan citizens not to be fooled by the Greek wooden horse that's famous for entering Troy. And in order to punish him for warning the citizens, the Greeks sent sea serpents to kill him and his sons. And that's what we're seeing here, the act of Laocoon and his sons being killed by sea serpents, orders by the Greeks. But considering the great age of the sculpture from around 40 BC, it's an absolute triumph of skill with marble carving. You can see how it's a really, really dynamic composition. It seems like energy is coming out of it. It seems to be moving and twisting. It's extremely dynamic. And in fact, the psychoanalyst Freud wrote a lot about the way that the main figure's eyebrows are all twisted, because he said it expresses how the figure was trying to repress his pain, because he didn't want his sons to see. It was an expression then of manly fortitude. So Freud was writing about this, about repression of the emotions. So, as I say, it's a very important work for many different parts of culture. But we can see all of Laocoon's muscles straining and moving, and the twisting of his sons too. So it's an incredibly dynamic sculpture. It seems to be a living, writhing mass, not something cold and static made in marble at all. And the absolute final image that I want to show you today is the baldacchino in St. Peter's Basilica itself. Now you might be thinking, oh, this is just a work of artisanship or a piece of architecture. But no, I think it's really a sort of sculptural installation, in my opinion. And it's designed by Bernini, the one who's famous for doing the encompassing arms around the piazza that I showed you at the beginning. This is a huge bronze canopy. It's said to mark the spot of St. Peter's burial in the church, so the original spot of the burial of St. Peter, the one who was given the keys from Christ. And many works by Bernini, if you're interested in him, are to be seen in the Borghese Gallery, which is in Rome too. So, and that's another wonderful place to visit if you're planning a visit. But Bernini is thought to be referencing the Laocoon that I showed you in the previous image because of the spiraling of the characters there when they're writhing whilst they're being tortured and murdered by the sea serpents. So Bernini is conscious of artists behind him in the lineage. Again, it's incredibly dynamic. We're seeing barley sugar spiral columns that reach up to provide the supports for the canopy. And it's also thought to be a reference to the Temple of Solomon, and therefore is intended to link the cathedral and the Catholic Church with the history of the church dating back right to the Old Testament. And if you look in close-up detail, it's covered in heraldic symbols and emblems that make it thought-provoking and extremely striking. So I would say this is one of the must-see sites in the world, and anyone who visits Rome on a Viking ship will be very lucky to go into the city and be able to look at this in the Basilica. So there's such a concentration of art to see in the Vatican City that, of course, I've just scratched the surface today. But I hope I've given you a taster of what you might be able to see on a Viking voyage. And just to recap, some of the themes I've covered today are the gazes that artists incorporate into their paintings, the self-portraits that they manage to inveigle into them as well, the compositional difficulties and triumphs that the artists came up with whilst they were working, and the idea of Rome looking backward to its heritage with ancient Rome and looking forwards as a city moving to the future too. And as I mentioned, I'm going to be on board Viking Venus from the 22nd of December, starting in Athens, going all the way to Barcelona. So I hope very much that I might meet some of you there on that voyage. But I know now that we are able to enter into a question and answer period too. So many of you might have been posting your questions. And we kindly have Claire from Viking with us today too. Claire will be able to announce what the questions are, and I'll do my best to answer them. Thank you for listening to my talk.
Hi, Emma.
Hi.
Thank you. The first question comes in from Diane, and she says, if at all possible to select, what would be your most favourite piece of art in the Vatican? Is there a piece of art that wows you every time you see it, as if it were your first time? And if so, why?
Oh, yes, I think it would be the Raphael Madonna of the chair that I showed in the presentation, actually. The one where the centripetal composition emanates from Jesus's elbow. I think for two reasons then, both those amazing compositional elements that's so complex and yet nobody notices unless they're pointed out, but also because there's a real beauty and humanity shown in the faces of the figures in that artwork. They look really human, and I think they bring Catholicism down to a human level, and they take it away from what Michelangelo did in the Sistine Chapel, making it a religion of fear. Instead, they make it a religion where you can feel comfort instead.
Thank you. Next question is from Lucy. She's also in the UK, and she has asked, could you tell us who built the Vatican?
Yes, that's quite complex, really, because it happened in many layers. So the first layer then would be around 324 with the first Emperor Constantine I. So that's when the first basilica was built on the site of where they thought the burial had taken place for St. Peter. You might remember St. Peter asked, could he be, he knew he was going to be crucified, but he asked when he was crucified if he could be crucified upside down, because he didn't want to compete with Jesus, whom he idolized, of course. So that burial spot is thought to be the place where the first basilica was sited. And now it's where the Baldacchino by Bernini is, my last slide. So that's the first layer then. But there are some other layers too. There's a big expansion by Pope Leo IV in 852. And then in 1508, Pope Julius II authorized the building of the Sistine Chapel and commissioned Michelangelo to do the ceiling there, then later the altarpiece. There was another building of an apostolic palace by Pope Nicholas V in the 1450s too. So lots of different layers. And then, as I mentioned, now we see Bramante's Basilica, which was built in the 1500s, and that was to replace the first one that was built in 327. So it's very difficult to know who built it, really. Lots of different people had a part in building it over many different centuries.
Thanks. Maddie has said that she's really enjoyed watching your talk, so thank you very much. And she would like to know how long you have been an art expert.
Oh, that's very nice of you to say, thanks. Well, I gained my PhD in 1997 at the University of Liverpool, and that was a PhD on the topic of the British sculptor, Barbara Hepworth. So I suppose you could say gaining a PhD might be the point when outside people would authorize me as having some expertise. But I've been teaching at universities since 1994, and I've been at my current university, which is Liverpool John Moores University, since 1996. And I hope I've gradually built up my expertise over all the years since I was first teaching in 1994. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Emma. Karen's question is, she is interested to know if you have written any books, and if so, what are they called?
Yes, I have. I've written two. One is called The Public Sculpture of Cheshire and Merseyside. So unfortunately, it's not about Rome, it's about the area of the UK where I'm based, because there's a lot of important public sculpture there. And the other book is also about my local area. It's called The Liverpool Academy, A History and Index. And the Liverpool Academy was a very important school of art and design, a bit like the Royal Academy in London. And it was, in fact, the second oldest in the UK. So I've written about that history. But I have two new books coming out, both in February 2022, so next year. One is called Art and the Sea, and it contains various chapters that look at how artists depict the sea in their works. And the other is very different. It's about contemporary Jamaican art since Jamaica gained independence in 1962. That's because I'm curating an exhibition starting in February in Liverpool about contemporary Jamaican art. So again, I hope that answers your question.
Next question comes in from Sue, and she asks, how did the Vatican become its own country?
Well, in 1871, Italy became unified. Before that, Italy had been lots of different states, and many of those were controlled by the papacy. So you can imagine that when it was decided that Italy would become one unified country, not really different states, the Pope at the time was not happy because they would lose a lot of their power and control to the Italian government instead. So there was a bit of a wrangle from 1871 onwards between the various popes in turn and the Italian government. And eventually an agreement was signed in 1929. And that was called the Lateran Treaty. It was decided then that the Vatican City would become its own sovereign place and separate from the Italian government. It would have its own mint, its own post office, its own rulers. So it was really in 1929, relatively recently, and as a result of Italy becoming unified in 1871.
A nice question to follow on from that. Actually, a couple of questions. So Ian, he asks, he's interested to know, can anyone live there? And also Richard has asked, is the Vatican the richest country?
Ah, yes, interesting questions. But no, it's not possible for anyone to live there. It's got to be the clergy or the support staff, very select, chosen to support the clergy. And I believe there's only about 800 people living within the Vatican City itself. And also about the next question, no, it's not the richest country in the world. And amazingly, it's not even in the top 10 richest countries in the world. My understanding is that Liechtenstein is the richest country, with Singapore next. And then the Vatican doesn't even figure in the top 10. It is surprising considering the value of the artworks.
Thank you. William, he has written in to say, a truly fabulous presentation. Wow, thank you. And was there a particular event in your younger life that might have spurred your interest in the Vatican?
Oh, yes, actually there was. Two moments in my life. One was that as a child, I remember happening upon British TV. This might not be understood by audiences from other countries, but in Britain we have the Open University that people can study at home online, and they've been able to do that since the 1970s. They used to do it by broadcasting TV programmes on the BBC. So I remember being about 5 and just happening upon a BBC Open University programme about the Vatican, which was fascinating to me, even though I couldn't understand a word of it at 5, but I remember being impressed and wanting to know more about it. And then also in my own family's history, because we are a Catholic family, and I know my own hometown, there was a patron saint who was turned into a saint in the Vatican in a ceremony, and members of my own family even went there to witness that event when the saint was made into a saint. So we always talked a lot about the Vatican and our family travels there when I was growing up too.
Thanks, Emma. A nice question's coming from David. He says, you mentioned that Michelangelo really did not want to paint the Sistine Chapel because he was a sculptor. Did his painting of the Sistine Chapel show any signs of his dismay?
No, I can't. Myself, I wouldn't see that he showed any signs of his dismay. I think we see his inner turbulence as an artist. Sometimes people put that down these days to his sexuality, because we know more about this than people perhaps did at the time. But we believe he's homosexual and that this was a source of conflict inside him. So his works are always very dynamic, very powerful, very anatomical. So I think we can sense that. And then his sense of the Catholic Church being something that is there to be feared, really, rather than something for comfort. It's all about awe, I think, in Michelangelo's eyes. Those are the things I would sense through his work, but not actually his dismay. I think once he embarked on it and was embroiled in all those technical difficulties, such as doing the physical things of making the fresco mural, I think he became quite entranced with the technical details of that and forgot his initial reluctance.
Thank you. Alison has asked, what is the oldest piece of art in the Vatican Museum?
Oh, that's thought to be an Egyptian sculpture. So from the Egyptian civilization that was just taken as a trophy, really, to the Vatican. And I believe that's from about 2000 BC. It's, think about 2 feet high and is sandstone. So there are lots of works of art from other civilizations in the Vatican to see, lots of different cultures, not just Italian and not just Egyptian. But yes, the oldest one is an Egyptian work anyway, this sculpture.
Thank you. Denise from London, she has put, does the art collection in the Vatican Museum continue to expand? And does it include modern art pieces?
Yes, to both parts of the question. In fact, they have a whole modern art gallery in the Vatican that's part of the Vatican Museums. So when you go through into the Vatican, you can choose to go to the modern art collection if you want to. And that has, for example, some works by, a work by Van Gogh, Matisse, so works that you would expect to see in modern art collection. And they do every now and then increase their collection. Sometimes that's just done through gifts from famous people who want to donate another work to the Vatican. And sometimes they commission new works. They're definitely not aggressive, though, in increasing their collection. The new editions arrive slowly, unlike an art gallery such as the Tate in London. They increase all the time, but they still do increase slowly in the Vatican.
Thank you. Questions come in from Colby, and he has said, quite a lot of the paintings found within the Vatican are mosaics. Why is this?
I think for 2 reasons, really. One is that the Catholic Church was always in battle with the Ottoman Empire, well, for many centuries anyway. So every time they had a win in the Catholic Church in the Crusades over the Ottomans, they would loot some of the Ottoman heritage. So it could be mosaics of gold and from the Byzantine Empire, and they would remove these from their original site in somewhere like Turkey or Cyprus and move them over to Catholic sites in Rome. And then also because there's a lot of ancient Roman heritage, of course, throughout Rome, when they did use mosaics as well, because they had learned that practice from the ancient Greeks in their temples and homes. So I think it was a 2-pronged thing then, from the Ottoman Empire and from the ancient Greeks and then the ancient Romans in Rome itself too.
Ed has sent in a question, and he asks, what is the value of the art collection at the Vatican, please?
Yes, really hard to estimate. I know the vast majority of estimates are around that it would be $15 billion US. And actually, I personally would have thought it would be a bit more than that, but that's what people think. Although it's so difficult to estimate because we only see, I think, around 20% of what's in the collection. So the people who are doing the estimating are relying on what they hear are in the rest of the collection that we never get to see. So there might be even more than that we don't know about, but around $15 billion US anyway.
Thank you, Emma. I was just looking through some lovely comments that have come in for you actually as well. So lots of people saying what a wonderful presentation. Thank you ever so much. Cynthia said a fascinating lecture from Dr. Roberts. I appreciate them.
Oh, thank you.
We have a nice comment come in from Michelle. Excellently presented, very appreciated. That was Michelle in Canada. And Sharon from Seattle, she says, this is a wonderful presentation. I'm looking forward to travelling with Viking again soon, and I will watch to see when Emma Roberts will be on various cruises. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, it'd be lovely to meet you all.
Okay, so this is your final question of the evening, Emma, if that's okay. And the last question comes in from Jerry, and he says, under which pope did the art collection expand the most?
I mean, they all did their bit and they all provided interesting contributions, but I would say it's Pope Julius II, the one who commissioned Michelangelo to do the Sistine Chapel ceiling, even though he hated it when he actually saw it. And he's the one I was mentioning, is in that famous film with Charlton Heston as the star, The Agony and the Ecstasy. So you could learn more if you were interested about Michelangelo and that Pope who did the most for the Vatican's art collection, Julius II. Oh, and so it looks then as if that was my last question. Thank you, Claire, for organising all the questions and reading them all out to me. And so I'll come to an end then. I wanted to thank you all for listening in. It's been fantastic knowing that even though I'm here with my own laptop rather than a live audience, as I am when I'm on board one of the Viking vessels, that I still have you all out there listening from your homes. And I do hope very much to meet you all in the future. So thank you all very much for listening. Bye.